Hello to all of our attendees from around the internet and around the world for the start of Season 3 of the CIES Webinar Series, organized by CIES, the International Center for Sports Studies, in collaboration with the FIFA Master alumni. CIES is an independent study center located in Neuchâtel, Switzerland. It provides top-level education, research, and consulting services. You can find more information about CIES, the CIES Football Observatory, or their education programs like the FIFA Master or the FIFA CIES Executive programs in the links in the description of this webinar. We find ourselves in March, which is International Women's Month, and today, March 8th, is International Women's Day. And that being the case, we felt it important to discuss the topic of women in sport. It's imperative that we use these global holiday events to serve as a platform, in this particular case, not only to highlight women in sport, but to understand where the industry stands in the collective aim to realize social progress in all senses, and to understand what we, as agents of change, can all do to help further that mission. I couldn't be happier to lead this discussion and really an all-star panel of experts to help me and hopefully help you, our audience, to learn more about the state of play here. A quick introduction of myself. My name is Julian Smith. I'm a dual citizen of the United States and Portugal, and actually, my full name is Julian Miguel Almeida Rodrigues Smith, and I'm coming to you from Porto in the north of Portugal for anyone doubting my Portuguese credentials. My professional history is around data, technology, and innovation, both in and out of sport, but I'm honored to have been invited to moderate today's session by CIES, given that I, like the rest of the panel today, graduated from a CIES education program. And for today's panel, actually, we are all graduates of the FIFA Master program. I myself graduated from the 19th edition, and with that link made, allow me to introduce to you my fellow alumni on our panel today in alphabetical order. First up, we have Meskerem Tadesse Goshime, a national of Ethiopia and a graduate of the 16th edition of the FIFA Master, calling in from Cairo, Egypt. Meseke, as her friends know her, has many years of experience, primarily around football administration and women's football development across Africa. Before joining the FIFA Master, Meseke worked as a football development manager and coach in Ethiopia, in addition to serving as the Deputy Secretary General and Acting Secretary General of the Ethiopian Football Federation. Since graduating from the FIFA Master, she has, since 2017, held different roles for finals tournaments of the Confederation of African Football, or CAF, like the Africa Cup of Nations, and currently works at CAF as a senior manager of women's football development. In addition to that extensive work experience, Meseke holds 2 graduate degrees, a master in sports science, with the other being the aforementioned FIFA Master. Thanks for joining us today, Meseke. How did I do in pronouncing your full name, by the way?
It was good. Thank you very much for having me.
Perfect. Next, I'd like to introduce Sophia Malicia. Similar to me, a dual national, but representing Argentina and Italy, calling today from Zurich, Switzerland. Sophia graduated from the 18th edition of the FIFA Master and also holds an earlier degree from the FIFA CIES Executive Program. After graduating from the FIFA Master, Sophia worked at the Buenos Aires Youth Olympic Games in 2018 before joining FIFA itself at their headquarters to work in football governance within the Member Associations, or MA, department. There, she is responsible for an assortment of governance matters for 50 MAs, including crisis management and prevention, contributing to MA development, and helping upgrade good governance tools for member associations. She frequently travels the world for this role so as to meet MA governance leaders to better understand their context and footballing reality. In addition to that important work, Sophia played an important role as a key project manager of the FIFA-produced Women's Football Administrator Handbook, a guide we will surely discuss more today. Hello, Sophia, how are you?
Hi, Julian, how are you? Oh, good.
Doing very well, thanks. Thanks for joining us. Rounding out the panel is Veronica Milhofer, a 4th edition FIFA Master graduate from Austria, who is logging in from Paris, France. Veronica also has multiple graduate degrees from the FIFA Master and Stanford and has a broad history of experience in sport event management and organizational leadership. She's currently spending her days with the Paris 2024 Summer Olympic Games Organizing Committee, having also worked at the Summer Games of 2020 held in 2021 in Tokyo and London 2012. In addition to the Summer Games, she's worked with ice hockey for the Paralympics, Winter Olympic Games, and International Ice Hockey Federation, and has also spent much time in the global rugby world, contributing to event organization at European Professional Club Rugby, holding the post of CEO at Swiss Rugby, and currently sitting as a council member of World Rugby and sitting as a board member of Rugby Europe. If ever we needed to look for a real sports administration superhero, I would nominate Veronica first. Welcome.
Wow, thank you very much. It's nice to be here with you.
Thanks, Veronica. Right, intro's done. Let's get straight into it. Please, to our audience, remember to ask questions in the chat accompanying this webinar. We'll pose these to our panelists either as the conversation flows, but definitely with some time that we'll leave towards the end. So the title of today's topic is Women in Sport, but really that alone can refer to a lot of different things. So I think we should start by breaking this down into women in sport and women's sport. You all, to some degree, have experience in both of these areas. So I'd like to ask how we should think about them as related, but also importantly, separate. So Meseke, could we start with you? Could I ask you to share some thoughts about this first?
Thank you. Thank you, Julian. I think that there's a vague concept of people not understanding what's the difference between women's sport and women's sport. When people think about women's sport, they think about women in sport also. It's different in a sense that when we talk about women in sport, we talk about women who are administrating, who are leading, who are serving in sport industry in different roles. But when we talk about women's sport, we're talking about a particular sport that's practiced by women. Football, for example, we have the men's football and the women football. So for me, I work in football, so I'm going to be giving more example of football. Sorry. For me, as working as a women's football development manager, my role involves both. I am in charge of developing women's sport, which is particularly football, but I'm also in charge of developing women who are working in football. So when we talk about developing women football, we're talking about grassroots projects, giving more competition for women. When we talk about women in sport, or when I work with women in sport, it means that I am working to empower women in sport, administrators, accountants, leaders. So we do empowerment programs for women in sport, and we do seminars and workshops. So there is a difference in terms of women in sport and women in sport.
Thanks for that, Meseke. Sophia, let's go to you because you have some experience in kind of the administrative side of this, but also how that affects development and growth on the pitch and off the pitch, right?
Yeah, there I needed to unmute. So yeah, I think that it's important to make this difference that also Meseke did. So one thing is the game or the sport and the participation of women in that sport, and important that women's sport has strategy, financial support, development programs, and make women's sport grow professionally. But then we have women in sport, and is that women's participation at all levels, no, in sports institution, at decision-making bodies, women sitting at the table. But I think that when we started speaking about women in sport, are all these stereotypes appear around this, and that women can only discuss about women's sport. It is something that comes up in several discussions when I have with members association, and more in the context when I'm revising the composition of the council or the Congress, that position that is reserved at the council for a woman, that woman needs to be in charge of women's football. or the delegate who will represent women's football as a member needs to be a woman. So it's this thing that only women can discuss or take decisions related to in the case of FIFA, the member association FIFA of women's football, and it cannot be like done in other areas, and they don't understand that members at the council needs to have this holistic view, and is this thing that gender is defining our capacities, our interests, and our abilities. So I think that in the past years, more and more discussions have arisen about equality, in particular in women's sport. Like we have one maybe that everyone knows is this fight for equal pay, or also for finance support, and also more role model had appeared on pitch, role models on pitch. But I consider that and compare with other professional environments, it is necessary to start discussing more about women in sport. And although we need to work on both areas separated because they are different, one is the game itself and the other one is the decision-making process, for me, it's something that we need to work in the development and growth of women in sport and women's sport on and off the pitch in parallel. Although we need to treat them like separated, for me, they are completely related.
Yeah, very good points raised there. And you touched on something that I want to get to in a moment, but I'd like to ask Veronica to offer her kind of insights based on her experience, again, in these kind of leadership positions particularly.
Yeah, as the other panelists have already touched on, I mean, it's a hugely important task to encourage more girls and women to play sports, to really play women's sports. But at the same time, what's often overlooked or thought about less is really to have more women involved in sport, really at every level. For example, I was fortunate enough to be voted onto the council of World Rugby, of the International Federation of Rugby, and before that there was never any woman on that council in the history of World Rugby. Now with me and a number of other women joined at the same time in a conscious effort to expand and get more women involved in sport, women in rugby. Similarly, I'm on the board of Rugby Europe, where I'm currently the only woman, and there's also a push and an effort to get more women involved in it, while at the same time on a sporting side developing the women's game. And as Meseke touched on previously, a lot of times when women are invited into a sports organization, it's kind of a well, there's a woman on our board, so she'll take care of women's soccer or football or rugby or whatever. But it should go beyond that. For example, I'm on the board of Rugby Europe, and I'm the chairman of the Audit and Risk Committee, which has nothing to, not for women's rugby, but rather for the finances of rugby. Perhaps because I have a background in finance, I have an economics degree from Stanford University. Not because I'm a woman, this will be my topic, but rather we look at what people's competencies are, no matter whether it's a man or woman, and try and get them into that kind of position. So I think that's a really important step to get women into these kind of leadership roles based on their competencies, not just on the fact that they're a woman or that that's a man.
So you raised a lot of really interesting points there, Veronica. And I think, the one that highlights the most to me is that this concept of representation matters. Seeing women in these leadership roles provides inspiration, provides all sorts of motivation for women who aspire to be in those leadership positions and knowing, okay, I can do this. Other women before me have done this. But unfortunately, as Sophia kind of alluded to, there's still this significant gap with representation of women in these senior leadership positions, particularly in sports administration, due to these stereotypes and biases. I mean, it's almost a historical travesty that the world has, for just this simple reason of gender alone, discounted 50% of brain power on the planet simply because of their gender, right? So, Veronica, allow me to stay with you. If you could kind of speak more to this concept of unfair stereotypes being attributed to women in sport, particularly given your experience, that would be quite illuminating.
Yeah, we all know there's a lot of stereotypes, and a lot of times sports world is a male dominated world, both in the sport itself, but also in the business of sport and the administration of sport. But it's important to remember that some of these stereotypes that might prevent women from integrating into the world of sports in a leadership position, they're not just in the heads of the guys sitting in the same room, but they're actually often ingrained in society. And I want to tell you an anecdote to that, where I even caught myself in such a stereotype once when I was the CEO of Swiss Rugby. We used to organize a lot of domestic events and occasional international ones. The domestic ones, we work with a local organizing committee in a local town or township where we're going to hold the event. And then at one point, I was on my way on the train to an organizing committee meeting, and I was the CEO of rugby, so I was in charge of the whole thing. My train was delayed, so I told them, look, just start without me. I'll come in a little bit late, and then I'll catch the rest of the meeting. So I got in, everybody was sitting around the room. I just kind of waved hello, and the meeting went on. So I didn't have a chance to meet everybody in the room, and then the meeting went on. I tried to figure out in my head who was who, to know, for example, who was the groundskeeper in the stadium, that we would discuss a certain amount of issues with regarding the grounds, and then who might be in charge of hospitality and things like that. And then there was, as so often, a whole group of men, and then there's one other lady other than myself. It was a blonde lady, and she had a computer, and she was kind of noting things and everything. So in my head, I figured she is the secretary of the organizing committee, taking notes. Lucky for me, I didn't say anything to that extent. And by the end of the meeting, I was introduced to her, and she was the mayor of the town. Far from being the secretary, she was actually the most senior, highest person in the room. So then I thought to myself, how could I, who's worked in this business for 20 years, as often the only woman there who is never the secretary, automatically assume she must be the secretary? Of course, it was totally wrong of me, but it made me realize that these stereotypes are ingrained in our society. They're not just in the heads of a few ignorant fools.
That's a really interesting anecdote. And again, I think points to the idea that even with someone so experienced and pushing for these ideas, there's these implicit biases that, while unfair, do exist and manifest themselves in these kind of unfortunate ways. But Veronica, you also mentioned this point about qualified people being in these positions, right, to demonstrate their capacity, and not just as a measure of putting someone in a position of leadership just to fill a tick box. So I want to go to Meseke and ask this question, because I think it's important to have people who are competent and qualified in these leadership roles as well, right?
Yes, I think it's important to have, like you said, qualified people in these roles, especially when it comes to women's sport. Like my colleagues have mentioned, the sport, a woman who's in the leadership, or a woman who's in the executive committee or in the higher board of an association or a sport organization is always pushed to handle the women's football or the women's sport rather than the one she's qualified for. Maybe she's coming from a different background, but we never see her background. Just because she's a woman, she is pushed to handle the women sport of that particular sport, the women's side of that particular sport. This sometimes backfire in a way that that woman is not getting the position she deserves, the qualification she deserves, and it backfire on the sport because the sport is not handled by someone qualified. this is one of the gaps we are actually really seeing in sport, definitely in football, where just because you are a woman, you are pushed to handle a women's football. On the other side, also you are qualified, but you are stereotyped in a way that, okay, since you are a woman, you're gonna earn small amount of money, or we're gonna hire you, but you're gonna earn a small amount of money because you are a woman. I have faced this kind of not discrimination, stereotyping, when I was qualified and I was offered to handle just the women's football right out of graduation, actually, of the FIFA Masters. When I went back to my association and I offered my service, they told me, okay, you have to go back of being a women's football administrator. And I told them, no, I have invested in myself and I have qualified more than the people who are in the top position. So I deserve a better position. But on the mind of those people, on the mind of the other people in the office, since I am a woman, the only thing I can do is lead the women's side of sport. I think this is one of the stereotypes really we need to avoid in sport organization. We have qualified women who can handle being a director, being a media officer, being a communication officer. There is much a position that a woman can fill, and qualified women are available to fill those positions.
Right. So it's this idea that just because you can make this easy association, it doesn't mean that someone should just necessarily be in that role. And even furthermore, that, you know, you need to balance kind of competency with opportunity, right? You shouldn't just give someone a role just because it's available and you need to fill a quota. And you want people, for the good of the sport, as you very well mentioned, to be qualified to be in those leadership positions. And I think we come to a good segue here also to bring Sophia into the conversation, because governance structures are really important here, right? And building kind of institutional mechanism to support this is super important. So can you talk about that in the realm of helping, from an institutional side, combat these stereotypes?
Okay, so like hearing from Meseke and Veronica, we all know stereotypes are real, and is one of the reasons I think that stereotypes is stopping of women being in sport, and that's why we don't have enough women in sport, and we are still talking or highlighting or be surprised about exceptions. We are still mentioning all the time the first woman at certain position, the only woman at this certain body, the only woman you in the room. I have heard many times, like, Shirley, I'm the only woman sometimes discussing or on a table with men, and it's like, you are a woman, we have a woman. Yeah, I know, no one needs to highlight me or to let me know that I'm a woman. And we need to reach a point that this stop being an exception and that becomes normal, that at the end it becomes to be a norm. And I think that here is that setting up good governance tools in the sports institution for sure, like, help that these stereotypes have less impact, or that they are like losing strength. Of course, these stereotypes will not disappear, but at the end, if you have like tools that says, I know that then it comes this thing of quota, and I don't want to enter there if we are against or in favor, or if we have some reservation. But at the end, if the statutes or certain regulations say, okay, at least there needs to be a woman sitting at the table, I think that there is the norm. So people start like seeing that, okay, we need to put it. I don't know how. It's not good, because at the end, it's as Meseke said, you need to be there because of your capacities. But well, it's a step. We need to use that. So I think that good governance tool helps to overcome stereotypes and help also to be like more supportive and helps to be more inclusive. So sports is global and needs to be accessible to all. And I think that maybe using good governance tools is help us to reach this objective, because I always say that strong structures, institutions with good governance tools in place are better. Like also you can see that on the pitch when they are like with the strong structures.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I even remember anecdotes about, considering women's health and the difference between how women have to prepare their bodies to play on the field. And if there weren't women administrators who were cognizant of that, then it would have a completely different impact on training schedules and all sorts of things, right? Sophia, I want to stick with you, but before I do, I want to remind our audience as well, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, please do put them in the chat so that we can pose them to our panelists here. This is really a unique opportunity, again, to talk about global women's sport and women in sport. So as I say, Sophia, let me stick with you because I want to follow up there, because we're kind of talking about this in theory to a certain degree, but you have actual practice in implementing some of these governance structures, let's say, to help support the topic today of women in sport and women's sport, right? So you work with the FIFA statutes. As I mentioned in your introduction, you also helped produce this Women's Football Administrator Handbook. So can you talk about your experience working with those and the impact on women's football and women in football and kind of what kind of success you've seen?
Okay, this I will speak from FIFA side because it's where I have experience, but I know that many sports institutions are start like having a strategy or an institutional level guidance in order to improve and have like a positive impact in women in sport and women's football. So FIFA has a strategy for 2026, growing the participation of women in the sport, but at the same time, women in sport. And one of the objectives that FIFA has is that all FIFA members associations has at least one woman at their council, but by 2026. So, and that at the same time, women's football is represented at the Congress or is represented at the Federation. So here we have like a key role, maybe with our team, and it's part of our scope of work in which we go to members associations and we try to discuss with them and try to understand the reality. We enforce and we like encourage them that they have women in the council, in the decision-making bodies. Of course, always we like many times I find like excuses like, oh, women are not interested in football. We will not have candidates. We are going to find candidates. And then you look out the window and you see that there are women playing football, and you are like, but if they are playing, there is an interest. The thing is that I know that it's very difficult to make the change, to make that first step. That's why I think that, again, we are coming on this, that it is necessary to put it as a norm or maybe in some regulations to enforce people like members association or institution to make that first step. Because for sure, when they will see that there is already one woman at the table, and they will see that, oh, this person at the end is discussing at the same level than the rest, like then, and I have seen this in many members associations, then I found out that they have like three women at the council, for example, or more than one, and they only don't stick with that, we can say, quota. So yeah, I think that it's important to have this strategy. Also, like some 2 years ago, we made this women's administrator handbook. The basic is a guide that offering like a better understanding of how strategy, practices, and procedures can reinforce the objectives of growing women's football and foster gender equality within members associations.
Right. So it's this leading from the top that is super important, right? So I want to bring in the rest of the panel here because you all have very different kind of perspectives on this matter. particularly institutional level initiatives in other contexts. So Veronica, let me go to you because we've discussed the idea that there is value to at least being in the room. So I wanted to get your thoughts about that and institutional level guidance, given that you sit on these boards and have so much experience in leadership in sport.
Yeah, I think it's really important for women to start having a seat at those tables in institutions. I mean, obviously, we might have a chance to talk about later what are other ways outside of those institutions to also impact change and make a difference. But certainly, those who know the governance and the world of sports know that it's these institutions like international federations, Olympic committees, and things like that, and national federations that run the world of sports. And so it's really important for women in leadership positions to start having a seat at those tables. That used to be practically not the case at all. And so even my generation, who's been in it now since the 90s, I was fortunate enough to kind of stand on the shoulders of those who came before me, who through definitely the 70s and the 80s had to fight really, really hard when doors were really closed tightly, and they managed to open them a little bit. And now it's my generation, and then also younger colleagues coming up behind, whose job is now to walk through them, take a seat at the table, and then obviously really important, not just sit at the table, but actually start to contribute. And to do that, it's really important to get educated, to get competences, to get experiences, so that when you get a chance, you actually know what you're talking about, and you can be credible, and you can contribute positively with your expertise. I think that Sophia addressed it. Quotas are one possible tool to open certain doors which might remain shut otherwise. But I think we all agree, and Meseke also talked about it, that a woman being in that seat just because she's a woman is not enough. She does need to have competences. But if she wouldn't otherwise ever have that seat, then a quota is one of the tools in the governance arsenal that could be useful. And also for sports organizations, having women in the leadership positions, it's not just about equality. As we all know, sports is a big business, and diversity of thinking and diversity of ideas are a competitive advantage in any business. Almost every modern corporation, successful corporation, knows that and seeks out diversity of thinking. And when a stereotypical sports organization leadership is made up of all white males between 60 and 70 years old, and I say that is a stereotype, but it's not totally untrue, then they don't have as much diversity of thinking and of ideas than if they bring on board some women, some different races, and just different backgrounds and ideas.
Yeah, that's great insight as well, Veronica. So I gather two things from there. First, encouraging people to gain that competency in various different ways. I mean, we have a panel full of 3 women leaders who are FIFA Master alumni who have achieved that graduate degree. So that's one way of doing that. But then also, to this point of, if sport is a business and you want to make good business decisions at a leadership level, you need to have the diversity of opinion and background and understanding of the people that you're trying to bring in as part of your fandom, as part of your audience, and all of those things. So Meseke, let's kind of unpack this in your perspective and context, because you have done great work in terms of building up sporting competition within African football, right? Both at CAF, through national tournaments and club tournaments. So let's get a little bit of your perspective here as well.
Yeah, I think when we talk about giving chance to women in sport, also we need to discuss about giving chance for girls in sport, or to girls to participate in sport. Accessibility is one of the key factors that we have a problem, especially in Africa. We have a problem where girls lack competition. we don't have access to competition, we don't have access to grassroots development. So for us as CAF Women's Football Development Department, we have already designed our own strategy. And one of the strategy we want to achieve is develop women's football, give girls access to football and competition. Last year we kick off our for the first time last year we kick off our Champions League. It was held here in Egypt. It was really an eye-opening of how women's football is growing. In Africa, we had a lot of clubs participating in the qualifiers, more than 40 clubs participate in the qualifiers, which is done zonally, and then we have 8 teams in the final. The match was televised live. There was a live coverage of YouTube and in beIN Sport and Canal Plus. And for these girls, this was the first time they ever even step out of their country to play international football. This was the first time they were seeing themselves on TV. So this is one of the things we can do for girls to give them access, because right now girls don't have access to competition. Also, they earn less than their male counterparts in any sport. If you see, it's the same thing. Through this competition, we have had more than 10 players who have been signed off professionally to play professionally. This is giving a girl child a career out of football. And we have now for the next AFCON, we have raised the number of final teams to 12. And through this, we have 3 new national teams that are qualified for the African Women's Championship. This is a big breakthrough, because I will tell you it will have a big effect for these 3 new qualified teams, because it will boost up their women's football development in their country. So when we talk about giving access to women, to empower women, we also need to focus on giving girls a chance to select football as a career. In Africa, it's a little bit difficult because sport is not a choice, a career choice for women, to tell you the truth. It's something that doesn't really seen by everyone as one of the career choices of a girl. So giving these girls a chance to compete internationally will actually make the parents think that, okay, my girl can represent her country, can be part of a women national team, can be part of a women club that can compete internationally. So this is some of the things we are doing in Africa, and I really like it.
That's great, Meseke. And I see almost a cycle of development here from all of your comments from the panel, right? So from a grassroots level, you're developing women's sport so that it can grow in terms of interest, but then also all of the other things that, better pitch quality, better television deals, all of these kind of things, which will attract more business and get more eyes on it, and then also inspire other young girls to participate in the sport that they're watching and give them the opportunity to not also participate as part of the development path. So it all works here. It's all coming together. But since the beginning of this webinar, really, we've talked about these kind of large theories, these institutional level guidance that takes a lot of effort and isn't quite these are initiatives that take time, right? But I think it's important also to understand that we can be agents of change on a daily basis. We don't need to wait for leadership from the top to give us a mandate to be able to institute these things. So I'd like to also ask all of the panel to provide some ideas of practical takeaways that we can offer to our audience to get this process started, to help even incrementally achieve progress within your professional life or sporting context, to help women in sport and women's sport, together to raise these concepts up. So Veronica, could I ask you for some comments on that idea of, what can our audience practically take away to help this?
Yeah, that's a great point and great question, Julian, because obviously we can't all write FIFA's women's football strategy or affect women's football in Africa like my colleagues here on the webinar, which of course are huge impact pieces of work. But I think there's a lot that even individuals can do if they wish to engage and encourage some change and create some positive change for women's sport and women in sport. I mean, it starts as small as if you're involved in a local club in whatever sport you might be involved in, encourage more girls to participate, or coach a girls team, or start a girls team, or a women's team, and from there encourage some of the women or girls to get on the committee of the club or the leadership, and from there it goes into maybe a regional association or a national association. You could help with a local event yourself, encourage more girls to do so, and so on and so forth. But of course, there's also some grassroots organizations where you can engage to do that. A really particularly good one that I've been lucky enough to support now and then in different endeavors and projects is called EPF. That's the Equal Playing Field Initiatives, and really their goal is to create awareness and to run projects that will help create an equal playing field for women and girls, particularly in football, but also with a vision, of course, to other sports. It's starting in countries where particularly women and girls don't have the same opportunity, but also in other countries where it's a matter of there's not this equal opportunities and there's not equal pay and things like that. So that's just one of many ways in which one can engage at a personal and grassroots level.
That's great, Veronica. And I actually think we're kind of addressing in this section one of the comments that was posed to us from an audience member, Sofia, who's asking about getting more experience towards those leadership skills for women in sport that she can then apply within her work. So let's keep going with this practical advice. Sophia, how about you, from all of the work that you've been doing? Any thoughts?
I think that my advice would be more from a personal, because sometimes these bigger strategies, we need to wait for the institutions to take that decision, or that that decision comes from the top. So I think that I would like to say, like, hearing from all, like also my colleagues, like the stereotypes needs to be broken from our side, needs to be ended in our side. And that thing of if I enter into a room and I see like a woman, maybe she's the secretary or she's helping, and we need to be maybe the women's supporting other women's. And if they gave us the chance or an opportunity, try that when we have the chance or the opportunity to give it to others, keep that opportunity. And then I would say that if you have the opportunity or the chance to be discussing on a table, or be on a table, or any chance that you have, take that opportunity and take that responsibility. And you can be responsible to make that change. And maybe now you are the only woman at the table, in the room, or in certain position, but try not to make it that is something special. Because what we need to try is that we need to normalize this. So there will be a point in which people will start normalizing the situation. Okay, you are today, maybe it's the first time that you are the only woman in the table. Well, they will get used to that. So try not to make it, for me, special. It's like, okay, you are there, and if you can't raise your voice, be confident, have like self-confident that if you are there is because you reach that point and you can do it, and normalize the situation. That is what I will say.
That's a great piece of advice, Sophia, and something I've heard in my own life. You know, this concept of we're all faking it till we make it, to a certain degree. And if someone was presenting you with an opportunity for a challenge that, you know, what I'm trying to say is we're all faced with challenges in our professional lives, and nobody feels prepared for 100% of the things that are put in front of you. And we just have to rely on our competencies and have confidence in ourselves to be able to push forward, right? So maybe at the starting point, don't think of that as a barrier. Take the challenge, go through the door, and like the rest of us, you'll figure it out because you're a smart, qualified person who's been offered the opportunity, right? So, okay, I wanted to make that point, but Meseke, let me bring you into the conversation as well and get your thoughts about practical advice that we can share with our audience.
Thank you, Julian. I think one of the things that Sophia mentioned repetitively is the policy changes and the status changes that's happening in the international sport organizations. I believe we really need to capitalize on this, and regulations need to change so that women can feel safe to practice sport and can be part of the sport industry. I give you an example. For example, UEFA have in UEFA Women's Champions League. If a player is pregnant, then the club have a chance to replace that player. This kind of regulations will make women feel safe. This kind of changes will make girls practice football. So anyone who's listening now, they can do a little bit of changes. It can be like, for example, a club licensing manager making sure that the clubs, the contract of a women's player include maternity leave. This is small change that we can actually capitalize on, and making sure that after the policies are on place, that it is actually is implemented. For example, FIFA says all member associations need to have one woman in their board member, one woman as a board member. It needs to be implemented. So this can push to a greater change, I believe so. And as someone who's involved in women's football development, our role is to actually empower those women. Yes, they got the chance to be part of the sport industry, but we need to empower them so that they can stay in the sport industry. They can do their best in the sport industry, and they have the knowledge to perform the task that's given to them. So this is, I think, the things we can do to make sure that women are in sport, stays in sport.
Yeah, again, more great advice. I think I'm overwhelmed with all of the things that I've been learning about and trying to make sense of. So thank you to all of you for all of your insights here. As I mentioned, I do want to go to our audience as well, who's coming in with a few questions. Let me start with this question from George Youssef. Hi, George. He says, I work in youth sports developing in Egypt with a unique approach, currently focused on female sports access. My question is, are there any funds directed at social entrepreneurships to help develop and grow reach and quality of training? We kind of alluded to this in part of the conversation, but does anyone have any thoughts? I think a lot of you can kind of address this on the different contexts. Sophia, do you want to go first? Searching for that unmute button. Take your time.
Yeah, I'm like looking. Well, I think that as an institution, maybe as FIFA, we don't have. Of course, there are different programs at the FIFA level, like for develop or grow or reach quality of training. There are different programs at the technical department, then also the women's football division also have like different programs. But it's not directly that we fund a social entrepreneurship. If not, it's more directed to people, and you can apply to those programs, and generally are coming from people that works at the members association. So they develop certain skills to then apply in their members associations.
Great. Meseke, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I will just like advise George that first, thank you for working in women's sport. The second is like he should try to approach a lot of NGOs, non-governmental organizations who are focusing on women sport development or women empowerment. So that's my advice. And I think you will find, especially if he's based in Egypt, you will find a lot of NGOs, non-governmental organization who can help him to develop his program.
That's great. Thanks, Meseke. So it sounds like a couple of resources there to explore. Let me move to the next question, actually, which is from Mario Vargas Javer. Hi, Mario. He says, good morning. So I guess it's early for him. What's your advice for someone who strongly believes sports are a tool of achieving gender and sex equality, but has never worked in sports? What's the first step to begin in? I mean, we've talked about this value of walking through the door that's open, but it sounds like Mario is just trying to even find the door. So Veronica, I don't know if you have any advice to even look into, where to step through some of these barriers.
Yeah, certainly. Hi, Mario, and thanks for that question. And again, thanks for your interest and effort in working in sports towards gender equality. Well, as I mentioned before, it could start as easily or as small as a local club or a local school that might be involved in, and just encouraging maybe a starting or expanding or developing girls' sport or women's sport. That's obviously addressing kind of the participation side. Thank you. Happy Women's Day to you as well. But then you can go also further and look at organizations that are running different programs, and they're always looking for volunteers, and even beyond that, certainly for support administrators or communicators or marketers or whatever might be your expertise that you could give. That's always appreciated by those organizations, and that's a great way to get started.
That's great, Veronica. Anyone else, Sofia, Meseke, any thoughts to contribute here? Meseke?
I think Veronica covers it. So
I would say so. I think my only contribution here would also be the value of networking, right? I mean, not only joining these networks, like, we have quite a strong network within the FIFA Master alumni, but then also just being part of the industry, understanding what the conversation points and staying apprised to the different news that's coming up, I think is quite important as well. Another comment that we got actually that I wanted to pose to the panel here is the concept of, women's sport versus men's sport and kind of the regulations that apply to both, particularly on the pitch, right? So I think there was this comment after the recent Australian Open final, this article that came out that was saying a 3-set format is an insult to women and an injustice for men. So, this idea that women's sport needs to be adapted in some way for various reasons, whether it's, I don't know, there could be all sorts of justifications for it. I think in basketball, we see that there is a smaller ball size, but in women's football, as I understand, the regulations are exactly identical, right? So what do we make sense of this? How do we think about this on a global scale? I'll pose it to the panel. Anyone have any ideas? Go for it, Veronica.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's a really interesting discussion, and to me, it's, in my view, it's impossible to say that it's all black or all white, that it's all yes or all no. I think on one side, if you want to provide equal opportunity, then it merits the thought of adapting certain aspects of the game. I'll give an example from rugby. I used to play rugby for 20 years. Where men who have larger hands, they can hold the ball in one hand, and if you've seen Fiji play rugby, do spectacular things like pass it behind their back, around the front, and things like that with one hand. But women who have, on average, smaller hands, they can't hold the ball like that, so they would never have the opportunity to provide what's an important part of the game of rugby, which is this element of fun and showmanship. So if we have women play with a smaller size 4 ball rather than size 5 with the men, are we saying women aren't as good as men, or are we trying to provide them an equal opportunity to make a move that a man can make? That's just one example of why I think it merits thought of should certain aspects of the game be adapted to make the game truly equal. Equal doesn't mean the same. Equal is an equal opportunity to play the game the same way.
That's a great response. Meseke, Sofia, any additions to that? Meseke?
I think it's also reflect on the lack of research that is done in the women athletes perspective. Most sport research are done from the male athlete perspective, using the male anatomy, the male physiology, and the male performance. This is one of the things we are trying to close the gap with. We are providing our coaches that women need to be trained as a woman because our performance vary because of all the cycle that a woman goes through per month, all the hormonal change a woman goes through per month. So our performance varies. In terms of athletics, we're seeing the gap between the finish time, like the gap is closing up, and we are also seeing the gap in terms of performance in football closing up. So we believe that if a woman is trained actually as a woman rather than as men, and we do performance trainings based on the hormonal change a woman goes through each month, maybe that we will even close those gaps. That's my thinking.
That's a great point. And I think that also goes to an earlier question from Mario saying, what can I do? How can I help if I don't really know where to go? I mean, there's such an opportunity given the, relative underdevelopment of women's sport in general and women in sport as well, to do women specific research, particularly on the pitch, because they're totally different contexts, right? Sofia, any additional thoughts from you?
No, I think that my both colleagues, they were like very into the point, but I think that I would like to highlight these. We want equal opportunities, but not treated like it's treated equal in the opportunities, but at the same we need to realize that we are different. Like, for example, our anatomy is different, so we cannot expect that our hands will like bigger so we can like catch the rugby ball or a basketball ball. So I think that all the studies so far have been on men. So what we need is what Meseke, I think that is important to study, to understand, and that is the only thing that will allow us to have that gap, like to break that gap that we are having now. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks for adding there. I mean, what I take away from kind of the consensus here is that there's not really one right answer. It kind of depends on the context, and it depends on the sport, and depends on so many other things. And whatever the decision is, it's not necessarily the right answer, but it always needs to be scrutinized and certainly measured over time, right? Things change, and we need to consider that as well as things develop.
And then, Julian, one thing that it was one of the questions. Sometimes you don't need to be like in the biggest institutions or in the biggest places to make changes. I think that also that Veronica mentioned before. Sometimes you can be in the club of your neighborhood or doing research or volunteering in some program or entrepreneur and make the change there.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think a great message actually for us to close on, considering that we're coming to time here. Thank you to everyone on this panel. This was a really enlightening conversation. For our audience, if you enjoyed this episode, have a look through the library of videos of the CIES webinars over the past 2 seasons. A variety of different sporting topics were discussed, many of which feature similarly excellent FIFA Master alumni from all different contexts. The next episode of this series, for this season rather, will be on April 5th, so you can mark your calendars already and expect to hear what the topic will be and who the panelists will be in the coming days or the coming weeks. For now, though, I'll call it officially a wrap. Thank you again so much to Sofia, to Meseke, to Veronica for all of your knowledge shared with us and your time as well. And to our audience, we will see you next time. Thank you again to everyone.
Thank you.